Hey, Soul Warriors, this is Jessica Noel, and today I just wanted to touch in with you for a moment to talk to you about how to love your shadows. So I feel like when we talk about how to love our shadows, how to love our wounds, it can be really helpful to think about where are they coming from. So often it's an attempt to get a need met, some type of need that is inside of us that has not yet been met. We're trying to get that met through these types of behavior patterns to playing out these types of dynamics. And it's never going to get that need met, but it's an unconscious attempt at getting a need met. Other times it's an unconscious attempt at avoiding something painful, avoiding something bad. So there are even times where it's a trauma response, but sometimes it's just sort of this knee jerk reaction that takes place that is more of a unconscious desire to avoid pain. So we have two things: unconscious desire to avoid pain and attempting to get a need met. The other thing it can be is conditioning from childhood. So if we think about the wiring, the programming that takes place in childhood from our parents, caregivers, or anything that going on in our environment, it can even be cultural. That is something that wires into us and programs into us without our consent, right? It just happens, it takes place. And then it's up to us to either continue to play that out or to unravel that, to unwire it through awareness, through this process that we've been talking about: awareness, love, acceptance, and choosing differently as well. So, one thing that's really important as you think about how to accept, embrace, and love the shadow, we talked before about the importance of the shadows, that they're teaching you something, they're moving you towards something, they're moving you towards a gift. There's some things under the surface that are accumulating that are beneficial that you can't yet see as the shadow frequencies playing out. And then at some point, you move into fully the gift frequency. So, the shadow is a lower frequency of this gift that's inside of you. I want to give a couple examples of that. But first, I want to say that the approach to how to love this inside of yourself sometimes can be helpful to think about it as a child. So, children are innocent, they're pure. So, if you can think of yourself as a child, you can think of this through sort of looking at it through the lens of a child. This is not something that you're consciously trying to do or trying to play out in your life. So if you can tenderly and compassionately love it as a child, that sometimes is a really helpful way to frame it. So see if that resonates with you. I want to give you a couple examples. So with the shadow of turbulence, that's something where as it's playing out, it's building compassion under the surface. And at a certain point, you sort of pop out, and then there's all this compassion, and you move into this frequency of compassion. But the turbulence was necessary to get you there, right? And one of the things we talked about is that there's a pairing of turbulence with the gift of discernment. As you get the gift of discernment, then the turbulence starts to cease, right? Because you're not any longer putting yourself in situations that are going to cause these type of turbulence. So it's kind of like this connection of, okay, discernment is one of the solutions. That's like the underlying issue, we could say, is that if as you gain discernment, then the turbulence can cease and the compassion can really fully bloom. I want to give another example of some of these shadows are easier to love. So when you think about like turbulence, it's like, okay, well, someone's going through suffering after suffering, pain after pain. That can be somewhat easy to love because it doesn't really feel like there's something very dark in there. But let's talk about the shadow of dishonesty. That can be a really hard one to love within yourself and others. Shadow of dishonesty, the gift of that has to do with intimacy and vulnerability. So it's almost like an opposite, right? So there's a dishonesty trying to keep people away, trying to kind of put this mask on, and it's really attempts to avoid. It's attempts both to get intimacy and to avoid it, which is really interesting. So it's an attempt to gain intimacy, to have that type of experience through this masking process, through not being honest, so that you can get that without being vulnerable. And the gift is once that starts to break and there's a realization that the masking is not benefiting you and it keeps leading you to suffering for yourself and others, then it becomes about finally being willing to get vulnerable, to take off the mask so that you can receive true intimacy, right? So it's an attempt really at avoiding being maimed. So there's a fear in there that if you're vulnerable, if you take off the mask, there's some type of maiming that's going to happen that is going to be this forever type of pain, and it's going to be intolerable. So there's this unspoken, sort of unconscious, free floating fear, and it's not real, but that's part of what keeps it going. So it's an attempt to avoid this perception of a really intense pain through not being vulnerable. So if you can look at it that way, you can start to understand how to move into compassion, even with a shadow we tend to judge pretty significantly as dishonesty. Another example I want to give is a shadow where there's a lot of guardedness and even self sabotage. So, when there's a lot of guardedness or self sabotage, the root of that is typically unworthiness, right? So, there's a guardedness that's put up because the person that's having the shadow, they underneath the surface, they don't feel like they're worthy of this love or of this success or of this positive situation. So, they put this guard up because at the root of it, they don't feel like they deserve it. And there tends to be self sabotage paired with that as well, sabotaging a love connection, sabotaging a situation where success is going to come because at the root of it, they don't feel worthy, so they can't accept it. So they guard against it and they self sabotage because that's not a situation that they feel comfortable in. That's outside of their comfort zone. That's not something they feel like they can align with. So as they start to build worthiness, build self esteem, then that starts to quiet, that starts to dissipate. And then there's a willingness to start to drop the guard and to accept these things because they start to realize, well, wait, maybe it starts with the maybe I am worthy of this. Maybe I do deserve to experience good things. Maybe I could let this into my life. And then the last thing I want to share is about fear. So, really, the root of all of these things has to do with fear, right? So, when it comes to fear, that tends to be a really intense energy and it's often very free floating. So, if you can think about fear as a well, a deep well, and there's something scary down there, but you don't really know exactly what it is because you can't see down there. Think about, can I drop the bucket? Drop the bucket into that well and see what the contents are. Pull it up and look at the contents. So once you really see what it is, ask yourself questions. What's under this fear? What is this about? What need am I trying to get met? What am I trying to avoid? And once you start to ask questions and you start to see what the contents of that fear is that's limiting you or that's keeping you in the shadow or that maybe is the root of the shadow, then you can start to dissolve it. It will start to dissolve on its own once you look at the contents of it, because once you can see what it is, it starts to lose its power very rapidly. So I hope that this helps you in your journey to accepting, embracing, and loving your shadows and wounds. I have so enjoyed connecting with you today, and I will look forward to the next time. Bye for now.